Very good. If you would find Philippians, the 4th chapter. While you're finding that, a couple things to sort of catch up on. Tonight at 6:10, I will restart the class that I've been teaching on great chapters of the Bible. We missed one Sunday for ice, and then somebody thought they ought to go to Florida. Can't figure that out. The ice would make you want to go to Florida. And then last week we had the soup supper, and so we're going to restart that tonight at 6:10, back through that doors where we'll be. Then, kind of want to share with you, we did get a message this morning. John Fulton had a text from the family of Ralph and Florence Vale, and they basically said Florence may very well go to be with the Lord today. She's been fighting a long struggle, has been in the nursing home. Ralph is also in the nursing home. It's kind of a sad situation. He had a stroke after she was already there. And then I thought, if you're going to go to the Lord, Sunday's a good day to go worship. Pretty good day to be in the presence of God. And they've been people who've loved the Lord for many, many years. So you be praying for the Vale family. And then probably this next week we'll sort of bring to a close the collecting of resumes for our student pastor position. We have about 37 resumes so far. We'll have a few more that will come in. And that really is an important situation, hiring the new person to be the student pastor. And our personnel ministry team will begin to start reading resumes and prayerfully looking through that process. And so you be thinking about that. We'll just kind of keep you. It's a long process. You read resumes, you pray, you interview, you do references. There's a long process, so you be praying about that. That's an important thing for our church, and so that's kind of coming out. So today, I warned you last week we were talking about money, and I keep my promises. So actually what we're going to do today is we're going to look at this last part of the book of Philippians. We've been walking through it, and in the last portion, Paul talks about his own view of finances and how he thinks about money. And there's a lot of different things that he has to say throughout all of his writings, but in this particular section that we look at, he really talks a great deal about it, and we kind of get some good ideas for the way you and I should think about money and material possessions. In fact, some years ago I came across a book that was Jesus and Money, and it was just sort of a look at all of the things Jesus said that had to do with material possessions and things, the parable of the talents. He said a lot. In fact, the book sort of suggested that if you took all of the red letters in the New Testament, all the words of Jesus, and you just said, okay, these words are about money and stuff, and then you said these words are about heaven and about hell, Jesus actually said more words about money and material possessions than he actually did about heaven and hell. So obviously, Jesus says it's important, and we ought to think about it. So we're going to do that today, and we're going to talk about Paul and how he thought about material possessions and money. And beginning in chapter 4, you'll remember the context. Paul is in prison in Rome. And in those days, if you were in prison, you either worked for your food in a galley or hard slave labor, or you had to pay for your own food, and they didn't feed you. And so there is some financial needs that Paul has, and the church in Philippi, that's in Greece, northern Greece. Paul's in Rome. The church in Philippi has taken up an offering, put it in the hands of a young man named Epaphroditus. He has traveled from Greece to Rome, took the money, gave it to Paul. Now he's been sent back, and Paul has written what we call Philippians, and it is basically a thank you letter. And he's sending it back to the church at Philippi. And he says a lot of other stuff, but as he gets to this last portion, this is what it is. It's the thank you portion for the gift that they've given. And in doing that, Paul says some really good things. So let's begin. Chapter 4, beginning verse 10. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You are indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Yet it was kind of you to share in my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, Philippi is the main city in Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. And my God will supply every need of yours according to His riches in glory in Christ Jesus. So there's a lot of stuff in there. If you take these things, plus everything else we know about Paul, we kind of get a picture of a lot of things that have to do with stuff. And so there's 7 statements I'm going to make. And the first one that comes out of the life of Paul, and maybe not so much in this passage, but you got to begin with it, is that working is a good thing. Now, it's not here because Paul is in this situation not able to work. And the reason he needs the gift is because he's in prison and he can't support himself. But there's several things about work that we know from the life of Paul. Number one, he was a Pharisee. In fact, he says he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees did a couple things. One, they made a personal commitment to obey the law of God to the letter. But there were some other things that were a part of that. A Pharisee could not be a Pharisee. You couldn't agree and take the vow if you didn't have a job. You had to support yourself. You had to have a trade. You had to have a way to work. In other words, they said, okay, honor God, but be a redeeming part of society. I mean, he said work is a good thing. And by the way, we're going to practice this a little bit later. Eventually, I'm going to say work is a good thing, and I'm going to expect you to say amen. Okay, it's a practice thing. We're going to see if it works. I'll clue you later on, because you ought to say that just every once in a while, and sometimes it's good to practice that to encourage the preacher. But not only that, Paul, we know while he was on his missionary journey, what we think his trade was, he was a tent maker. Because in the book of Acts, the 18th chapter, when he gets to Corinth, he needs to support himself. There are no Christians there. There's nobody to help him. And so he goes to the place where there are tent makers, and he comes across 2 other tent makers by the name of Aquila and Priscilla. And they sit down and they begin to work together, and he supports himself. In fact, in writing back to the church at Corinth, he says, hey, you know, while I was there, I supported myself completely. I worked, I provided for myself. In fact, today, bivocational pastors, there are pastors who have a secular job and then they pastor. They're very often called tent makers because they do that. But it's also, you'll remember, that the Apostle Paul is the one who wrote to the church at Thessalonica. And there were people who evidently thought the world was going to come to an end right away. And so they just kind of quit work. And they were letting other people feed them. And Paul said, those that don't work, don't what? They don't eat. So bottom line is, he says working is a good thing. That's part of who he was. That's a part of his life. Working is a good thing. So let's just, now, the first service did pretty well at this. Okay, so I'm not sure how the second service, you guys should be more awake. I don't know, we'll see how it goes. We'll see about next week when you have to lose an hour's sleep. But, okay, point number 1, working is a good thing. Good. That was all right. We'll try that a few more times as we get to the end of each point. And I'll prompt you to help you. So the second point is, living within your means is a good thing. Now, that's also a part of this passage. Because you remember he says, I've had a bunch. And then there have been times when I've not had very much. And I get by. In fact, the great miracle, this amazing story about I can do everything through Him that strengthens me. The real context of that is being able to get by with whatever you've got. He says, I can get by. In fact, then when he talks about praying for them, at the end he says, and my God shall supply everything you want. that what it says? My God shall supply all of your needs. There's a difference between needs and wants. And Paul says in this passage, when he's thinking about money, that living within your means is a good thing. I mean, he says, I live on what I have. I live here, and this is how much I have. I live underneath it. And if I have this much, I live underneath that. And I'm able to do that because God helps me to do that. And I think there's pretty something significant about it. And I love this idea that wonderful verse, I can do everything with Him who strengthens me. I mean, we use that verse for all kinds of stuff. I will survive teenagers because God strengthens me. I will not kill my preschoolers because God strengthens me. I will get by with my boss because God strengthens me. That's all fine. But the context of it, the reason it's really said is, I can live within my means. Now, there's a little twist to that. Paul kind of makes that even more in the book of Romans. And in the 13th chapter of the book of Romans, he kind of has a little section and he says, oh, by the way, pay your bills, which means you need to be careful what kind of bills you make. He says, pay your bills, pay your taxes. And then he comes down and he says, and by the way, don't owe anybody anything. Don't be in debt, except for the debt of loving one another that we all owe. So he kind of says, as Christians, we should work. That's a good thing. And let's try it again. Okay. And then he says, the first part, he says, work is a good thing. And then he says, living within your means is a good thing. Okay, you weren't as excited about that, but we're still moving through here. Number 3, giving is a good thing. Now, you understand, this is a gift has been given. The church of Philippi took up an offering. They sent a letter. By the way, I didn't mention this the first service. You remember there was a lady in the church at Philippi from the book of Acts by the name of Lydia. And she was the first person that Paul met. She was a seller of purple, so she probably was fairly wealthy. We don't know much about that church, but we know that they're a generous church. And they gave a gift. And basically, Paul says that's a good thing. It was good of you to give the gift. And then he goes on and he says, and in particular, your giving was pleasing to God. Your giving was a fragrant aroma, a fragrant offering. That goes back to the Old Testament sacrifices that they made, and they put incense with them. And basically, he said, God has been watching you, and when you give, it's always a good thing. Do you understand that giving, when we give, in any context of it, that makes us like God? God so loved the world that He gave. That's God's nature. And you and I never really get much closer to the nature of God than when we forgive. The other one is when we forgive, by the way. That gets you pretty close. But giving is a good thing. It always is a good thing. In fact, Paul, as he's talking, and here's a little extra twist. This is 2 Corinthians. The context of 2 Corinthians, Paul is writing to a different church. And he's encouraging them to take up an offering to help the Christians in Jerusalem during famine and persecution. So they're going to take up an offering. And so he's encouraging that. And here's what he says as he's writing to the church at Corinth about the churches in Macedonia. That's Philippi. This is chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy, their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. They gave according to their means. Not everybody has the same means, but they gave according to their means. And then he says, and they gave beyond their means. They gave sacrificially, more than they could even afford to give. So he's talking to one church about this other church. And then he says, I can testify that begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in this offering for the saints. Isn't that amazing? He's saying to one church, this other folks begged for the opportunity to give. They saw it as a privilege. They didn't want to be left out of this blessing of being able to give. Now that just blows me away, doesn't it? I mean, I one time was actually in a service in a church where they forgot to take the offering. Nobody said a word. If it had happened in Philippi, they'd have said, hey, wait a minute, I got my offering. I want to give today. Don't rob me of the opportunity to give. But he says that for one church, and he says it about the other one. They just kind of finish this. He says, accordingly, we urge Titus, as he has started, so he should complete this act of grace. Grace and giving always go together. And as you excel in everything, and he basically says, you're an excellent church in faith, you're an excellent church in knowledge, studying the Bible, you're an excellent church in speech and witnessing, be an excellent church in giving and the grace of giving. I just like that. So now, one of the things that suggests is giving is a good thing, but it also says that some churches are better than others. I would just tell you up front, I think we have a pretty good church when it comes to giving. And I know enough about churches that we do give very well. But we ought to. There's no excuse not to. In fact, it would be inappropriate if we weren't. We ought to be that. We ought to be excellent in giving. And we ought to take it as a personal privilege, a blessing to be able to give. It's a whole other context in the way he says that we should think about it. So, all right. You ready? Working is a good thing. Living within your means is a good thing. Giving is a good thing. You're getting better. Works out. Okay, that's number 3. Number 4. Receiving is a good thing. Yeah, we'll work on that one. Truth of the matter is, for most of us, giving is a little easier than receiving, frankly. Some of us are really good at giving and not so good at letting other people give to us. Now, honestly, some of that's a pride issue. You know, I don't want anybody to do anything for me. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to be all on my own. I don't need anybody else. That independent spirit is a dangerous one when it comes to spiritual things. But Paul is now in a position where he has to receive. A man who believed in working, who worked all of his life, who made that commitment, who worked whenever he could. And now he's in a position where he can't work and he needs to receive, and that's okay. And the truth is that all of us probably at some point will need somebody to give to us. It may be help, it may be care, it may be material things, it may be finance, and it may be during a time of grief or sorrow or sickness, or it may be at the end of life. But the reality is that all of us probably are going to need to receive, and there's not anything wrong with that as long as you're not in a position where you just always are a taker and always a receiver. And frankly, receiving ought to humble us enough that we try to find the best way we can to give someone else in the future. They ought to always inspire that. So receiving can be a good thing. And he basically is saying, I'm okay to receive it. And they have blessed him on several different occasions. And we have that phrase from the Scriptures, it is better to, or more blessed, to give than to receive. But the word more means there is a blessing in receiving. And there's an even bigger blessing in giving. But sometimes you and I need to let other people bless us. And then we need to be able to bless others. And it kind of goes together. So, here's where we are. Working is a good thing. Living within your means is a good thing. Giving is a good thing. Receiving is a good thing. That one's a lot harder. I'll just be honest. I'm not real good at receiving. It's tough, but that's a good thing. Number 5, saying thank you is a good thing, and it is. And that's really what this letter is all about. It's Paul saying thank you. You guys were good to do this. And I'm not, you know, I know how to deal with need, and I know how to do all this stuff, but I just want to tell you, thank you for what you've done. Saying thank you is a good thing. And some folks, because they struggle with receiving, also struggle with saying thank you. And if you struggle with that, then you just need to get in front of the mirror and you just, thank you. Just keep saying it, thank you. Just keep saying thank you until you get good at it. And you need to say thank you. And you need to say it on 2 levels. You need to say it to people and you need to say it to God. You, God, thank you for the blessing that you've given, and if that blessing came through the hands of somebody else, then you need to say thank you to them both. And you need to say it, and you need to say it quickly and honestly and humbly and gratefully. And I love this is a thank you note. Now, when I write thank you notes, and I try to do that, it's 2 or 3 sentences, and I don't have the best handwriting, but he writes a whole letter. Of course, he's in prison and he's not preached for a while, so he's got some sermon material to use, and that's part of it. But he goes to great length to say thank you for the gift that you've given. And I hope that you are good to say thank you. And thankfulness is one of the most basic items of a Christian heart. And when you pray, you ought to say thank you. I don't know if you caught when we were talking about anxiety a few weeks ago, Amy Levine had a client who was having trouble sleeping. Would lay down and would stay awake, worrying about things and just worrying about things and hours and hours. And so they had a conversation where, okay, when you lay down, start thanking God for things. And so the first night, evidently the lady stayed awake for an hour before she got to go to sleep, which was better than she'd been in years. But she laid there for a solid hour thanking God for things. And evidently you get a little desperate when you're for an hour. I mean, thank you for my health, thank you for my kids, my grandkids, thank you for the sun, the moon, the stars, thank you. And evidently it got down to, okay, God, thank you for the things in the bathroom. Let's see, the toilet paper, glad that's there. And thank you for my toothpaste. She got kind of desperate, but just looking for anything and everything to be able to be thankful for. Thankfulness is a very powerful thing, and a lack of gratitude, ingratitude, is a terrible thing to bring to God in prayer or in worship or in anything. And I hope that you're grateful. I hope you say thank you to parents and to family members, and when someone has blessed you, we ought to accept that humbly, and we ought to say thank you. So, we're working on this here. Working is a good thing. Then living with your means is a good thing. Giving is a good thing. Receiving is a good thing. Saying thank you is a good thing. In fact, while we're at this and I've got you talking, just on three, why don't you all just say thank you, just because it'd be good to come out of your mouth and for you to have said it once today, all right? On three. 1, 2, 3. You're welcome. I just thought I'd throw that in there as well. But saying thank you, hope you're good at saying that. Number 6, contentment is a good thing. And it is one of the great miracles of this, because Paul says, I have learned to be content. Which, by the way, means that contentment is probably not an easy thing. That to be content with what you have, to be content with financial circumstances and situations is not easy, because he says, I had to learn to do that. In fact, I had to learn to do it, and the secret to learning to do that is God had to help me to become content. Now, I understand that we live in a world that is all about trying to convince you that you're not happy if you don't have more. We spend billions of dollars in advertising to say, you know what? You are not happy if you don't have a new car. You are not happy if you're not wearing designer clothes. You are not happy if you don't have this or that or the latest thing. If you're not going on this trip, you really are not happy. Your life is not complete if you don't have this. And that's just sort of a voice that's constantly in our world. And God is saying, you can be happy regardless of how much stuff you have. Whether you make $20,000 a year or $200,000 or $20 million, happiness has nothing to do with how much stuff you have. Contentment is something that comes from God. It is a peace. This last chapter we talked about had to do with peace. The peace that passes understanding. The peace that guards our heart and mind. Peace when it comes to my finances. Now, by the way, there's nothing wrong with saying, I'd like to have a raise. Or maybe say, I'd like to have a better job. Or I'd like to maybe be able to get to the place where we can afford some other kinds of things. There's not anything wrong with that. But if that drives you and that consumes you to the point that you're not happy with what you have, then you've missed the point. There ought to be this sense of learning somewhere to be content and to be at peace when it comes to material possessions. And Jesus, I think, made that very clear, that you and I are never going to be happy because of stuff. The rich young ruler who had all kinds of stuff but missed the most important thing. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world, all the stuff, and you lose your own soul? There's just something that's not right. And this concept and contentment in the end is the answer to greed. Greed is constantly out there. The temptation to always jealousy and want what other people have. And to be content in my own heart is a miracle. And it can be done. Contentment is a good thing. In fact, let's just run through them. Working is a good thing. Living within your means is a good thing. Giving is a good thing. Receiving is a good thing. Saying thank you is a good thing. And contentment is a good thing. One more. Trusting God is the best thing. I mean, that's really what this is all about, and that's why Paul is able to say it. When it comes to stuff, he says, listen, you just got to trust God. Did you know that God is not surprised by anything that happens in the stock market? God is not surprised by anything that happens in the economy. God knows what's going on. If your job lasts tomorrow or goes canceled tomorrow, God is not surprised by any of those things, and He is in control. And the ultimate element of our faith is that we have a God who is faithful, who can indeed take care of our needs. And that final prayer, my God's going to supply your needs from His riches in all of glory. God is going to take care of you, and you just need to trust Him. And the secret to being content about all manner of things that I can give because God tells me what to give, and I'm going to be able to get by on what I have. If I have times of abundance, then God has been faithful, and if I don't have as much, God is still faithful, and in the end, I can trust God. And that's part of it, that God is faithful. It's who He is. And what Paul really says is I just can trust God when it comes to money. Now, I'm going to trust God and go to work. I'm going to trust God and be careful about the bills I make and try not to get in debt. I'm going to trust God and I'm going to give when I can give, and I'm going to trust God and I'm going to receive when I need to receive, and I'm going to trust God in all of those things. But here's the last one, and maybe the most important one, is that very simply, trusting God is the best thing. Well, pretty good sermon, pretty good information, pretty good stuff, but maybe it's a lesson that some of us still need to learn. And I like the idea that Paul says, he's at the end of his life, and he said, finally, I got this figured out. I know how to be content. I've learned how to trust God. I've learned how to live on what I've got, and the ultimate statement is, you and I can do this because of Him who gives us strength.